issue, Harvey and Jim, is the Palestinians have no political power.
Right.
And this is what happens is that they become an afterthought. That, and that when you start talking about the possibilities for how does this end, what's likely to occur, the Palestinians have no agency, and if they have no voice in it, all they can continue to do is what they have been doing, is resist, right? And doing so as they have. But in terms of when you discuss this, how's a way out? What's it look like? Who are the people involved? The Palestinians, God help them.
Their only potential savior is the UN Security Council.
And that's not a
And
possibility.
it's not,
No.
I don't know if you saw the most recent uh, legal policy paper from the UN Commission on Human Rights on positing that Security Council veto uh, that uh, element of the UN Security Council is in the UN Charter, but that I think some of this they got from the International Court of Justice, but they just said a veto in the Security Council. I mean, these countries supposedly have that right, but that any veto that allows the violation of peremptory norms of international humanitarian law and the laws of war is null and void.
I think that's what most people who were to read it honestly would come to. That how
Yeah.
can you have a
How do
veto
you
that
enforce
that
this?
violates the charter? Right, right,
Yeah.
right, right.
But I'm just thinking politically, Israel's not going to give a damn. But for the U.S., if it comes to pass that these resolutions are passed and the vetoes are ignored, what is the next step for the U.S.? Are they at that point boxed in and have to stop arming this, or will they openly defy a binding Security Council resolution?
No, I think they'll defy the Security Council resolution. Yeah, I mean, I think you look at this, you go back to say the 1980s, and people remember the American Congress was very hostile in the 1980s to the United Nations, led by Jesse Helms,
Yeah,
and that
right.
had a lot to do with South Africa. That had a lot to do with the United States was the only one who was defending South Africa, as the rest of the world was understanding and acting towards South Africa's apartheid, some much sooner than others. But
Well,
eventually the world comes around, and by the early 80s, it's the United States against the world, or mid 80s, it's the United States against the world on South Africa.
the United States and
You
Israel.
see, yeah, in Israel as well. That's right. Yep. Yeah, and then, but what has occurred in the last 4 decades, because what also is occurring at that time, relations in the early 80s between the U.S. and Israel are strained. The United States is very unhappy with Israel, with its 82 invasion of Lebanon. A lot of people, if you're on social media, you'll see reference to this in terms of Reagan telling Prime Minister Begin to knock off the attacks in Lebanon, and Begin doing it.
Yeah.
But then also too, there's what comes from that, and also too, the American media is very critical as well of Israel during that time. And what comes from that is an Israeli understanding that we're very vulnerable here. If we lose the Americans, like South Africa eventually does, eventually political pressure in the United States forces the American government to change on South Africa. And then when South Africa loses that American support and backing, that's the end of apartheid South Africa, right? They can't stand any longer.
Yeah.
The Israelis recognize that. And so we have to insulate ourselves. We have to protect ourselves. And so that's when you see in the 80s, what we have this modern relationship with the United States and Israel really begin to develop, where you have very severe and keen, and I'll have to say, quite brilliant involvement by the Israelis in American politics and in American media. So whether it's the campaign contributions, the Israel lobby that people are very familiar with, but it's also too the pressure that the Israel lobby puts on the American media in both carrots and sticks to tell a story that is favorable to Israel. So you've had decades in the U.S. of just really favorable coverage of Israel by the American media. That is the bias is incredible, and you still see that because what you're hearing from younger journalists is that it's their editors. It's the editor. I was listening to a doctor who wrote a piece in the New York Times a week or two ago, doctor who had been in Gaza, who wrote about how 65 of his colleagues, they all had seen children shot in the head deliberately by Israeli soldiers.
Yeah.
And when he was discussing this with Amy Goodman, he was talking about how the preponderance, the overwhelming evidence he had to provide to the Times because of, and he said he heard this from other reporters, that their editors require so much evidence. Like it has to be so overwhelming that it's sickening. And you hear this from other people too. Not, I've heard this from other people commenting on this and stuff that I do in my work, my colleagues, people who travel in the same community as us. Our ability to penetrate and beyond corporate media on the legacy media is incredibly limited, not because reporters don't want to talk to us so much as the editors, the old guard there that have lived for 4 decades essentially under this policy of cooperation to go along, get along with the Israel lobby, the carrots and the sticks. But then the other side of the media too is Hollywood. It's the romance of Israel. It's a triumphalism of Israel. It's Israel as the beleaguered and beleaguered fortress. That makes up so much of their mindset. And you see that in Hollywood film. You see that in Hollywood television shows. The Israelis are always the heroes. The Israelis are always the ones who are going up against the Palestinian terrorists. And of course, there's very simple dynamics at play here: white versus brown, right? And so it factors into that as well, us versus them. And, so that change in the Israeli mindset begins in the 80s. And that's tied a lot to, one, the reaction towards their campaign in Lebanon, but also, two, watching what happens with South Africa and saying we have to protect ourselves. And so now essentially they are insulated in that way, where you still see the corporate media, you still see Hollywood, and you still see, of course, the American Congress and the White House and these 2 presidential candidates beholden to the Israel lobby, regardless of American public opinion, and especially regardless of the facts on the ground there, the reality of what's occurring. And this is something why I think, getting back to the Palestinians, why I feel that there's no hope for them. There is no hope for them because until something happens with the American empire and it loses its ability to prop up a state of 8 million people, right? I mean, so we've provided $23 billion to the Israelis in the last year. We can provide $50 billion. We can provide $75 billion. We'll do it. We've provided in 2.5 years, we provided $185 billion to Ukraine.
Yeah.
Right. And Ukraine doesn't have near any type of the infrastructure in terms of our politics and media that Israel has. So, I mean, certainly we look at the Palestinians and you say, my God, and this is what the Israelis are banking on, is that they have this support of the Americans and they don't have to change because we've got the Americans behind us. We've got the American empire behind us and we can do whatever we want.